So thanks, guys, for continuing with us on this series. Today we're going to be 7 of 7, the what, why, and how of blockchain, and the session's being recorded, and I'm shipping it over to you, Nate.
Awesome, thank you. Just gonna get my session up here.
And while Nate's preparing, I figured out how to do a YouTube channel, guys. So you'll be able to, or guys and gals, you'll be able to view all of the videos on our YouTube channel.
Ooh.
Yes, very exciting.
Do we get a cut of the revenue?
Thank you.
If we get enough views that YouTube starts paying us, I'll pay you, Mark.
Yeah. And I'm asking, like, when do I get paid? Because it took me like for hours to get them all on.
Right.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Anyways, I think we're ready. So as you guys know, we're on our session 7 of 7 today. We're talking about Kevlar. So what is Kevlar? A decentralized, you know, Karen, some of us do. At its core, Kevlar is a decentralized blockchain secured platform that enables individuals and groups and organizations to create and maintain a globally unique identity that can be integrated into any personal, commercial, or social system. So I know that's a loaded definition, and we're going to look at more of what this means, but I just wanted to give that concise description in case you guys want to jot that down. So let's look at now, or screenshot it if you're lazy like me. So there's a vision behind Kevlar, and it kind of comes down to two principles. The first is that we have a universally accepted proof and form of identity. And that's not the case today, and we'll look at why in a second. And the second is that privacy is a two-way street. And that means that whenever we're exchanging sensitive information, both parties have a responsibility to maintain the privacy of that relationship. And we'll look at more about how that exists in today's identity landscape too.
Yeah, before back to that slide, just to clarify, this is the Kevlar. This is the Kevlar vision. This is the world we want to live in, not the world we currently live in.
Yeah. Just give me 1 second here. Hang on for me, guys.
Can I help you with something?
No, I just have lost my file, but that's okay. Okay, so yes, this is the vision that we see for identity. Unfortunately, that's not the way things are today. So there are several problems that we can examine in the identity landscape today, and let's just look at a few of those. The first one is that we have multiple forms of identity and multiple platforms to manage them. We have an identity with our government. We'll have an identity with our financial world or with our banks. And those can take various forms: passports, driver's licenses, membership cards. There are all of these different platforms and scenarios which we use different forms of documents and evidence to make up our identity. But the problem is with that is that these platforms and these systems are fragmented. To give you an example, if I change my address on my driver's license, that doesn't change my address on the other instances or platforms where my identity exists. And in this digital era, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're still relying on these kind of systems that were designed for paper-based models. And a third problem with that is that because we're living in a digital era and still relying on outdated and paper-based systems most of the time, these identity products, even our driver's license and our passports, are pretty easy to be forged. And in any case, there's pretty low assurance that any given document is authentic. Wrong way. And so what this leads to is, because we have all of these different forms of identity that we need to prove for different purposes and different life scenarios, we also have fragmentation of the people who verify our identity. And the problem is, because there are different platforms and documents that we use for identity, these digital identity verification products have largely come about to only fulfill one specific niche or one specific use case of identity, especially identity in a digital context. And one of the most common forms of digital identity verification that we see today is what's often referred to as KYC, or Know Your Customer, and AML, which is anti-money laundering. AML obviously particularly applies to your financial identity. And even with these KYC and AML services, fraud continues to be an issue because they're fragmented and there is no enforceable certification that these service providers have to follow. They're just largely companies providing verification services. There's nothing to integrate or to tie all of these verticals in identity together. Does anyone have any questions about this set of problems before I go on? Try to remember to keep an eye on our conversation here.
I think we're good.
Cool. So what this leads to, especially in today's digital world, is this dilemma that we face. On the consumer side, we have all of this often digital, personal, sensitive data, and we want to keep that private. But on the company side, there are more and more processes that we have to manage and monitor in the digital environment, and that introduces more of a demand and more of a requirement to follow regulations and to remain compliant to certain within certain business contexts. So there's really this push and pull and this dilemma between these two forces, and they're both significant forces in identity. So Kevlar aims to be the middle ground, to bridge the gap between data privacy and regulatory compliance. And it does that by allowing individuals and entities to maintain privacy and anonymity while still remaining fully accountable and therefore capable of meeting compliance requirements that governments and businesses face. So what does that look like? Well, let's look at what makes Kevlar innovative first. Now, the interesting thing about Kevlar is that it's not incredibly innovative. It's pretty easy to create a decentralized identity platform. Now, it's a little bit harder to make it accessible to everyone in the world. And it's even harder to make that solution viable for every scenario or application for identity that exists in the world. So what really makes Kevlar innovative is it's a holistic approach to designing an identity platform. And this holistic approach is aimed to allow anyone to create and maintain their identity largely for free. And there are some other kind of unique and novel concepts that exist in the Kevlar product and technology. But if we look at the solution at a high level, this is kind of the most innovative and unique aspect that we look at. So this is kind of a summary or an introduction to the types of participants or the types of users that might use or stand to gain from an implementation of Kevlar identity. So we have groups and organizations who need to verify their users' identities or verify certain attributes about their customers in order for the company to function properly. That could be to follow legal regulations. It could be to enable certain customer-to-customer communications. It could be anything. But these are the participants that are essentially asking, who's there? I need to know something about your identity. The second type of participant in the Kevlar network is people who want to be identified easily. Those are the people who say, it's me. I'm someone who's signing into a web platform or trying to gain access to a certain real world event. And these people also have an interest to maintain privacy and control of their sensitive identity data. And we'll look at how they do that in a second. The third type of participant, though, is a critical one, and that's the person who says, I can prove it. Now, what does that mean? The I can prove it type of participant is an organization or an entity who can validate the authenticity of the individual or the user's identity and can provide proof of that identity. So these are the core kind of participants that we see in the Kevlar ecosystem. And there we go. And then let's look at how that applies to the technology of Kevlar itself. So the first piece of Kevlar's kind of call it a high-level architecture is we have 3 different blockchains. We said this was a decentralized blockchain solution, but we're actually not looking at just one blockchain network. There are actually 3 separate chains that each serve their own purpose. The first chain is what we call the identity chain. This is where each individual person that is using or participating in the Kevlar network goes to create a blockchain record that only stores the most basic and fundamental information that's required to record you as a unique individual on the Kevlar identity chain. It's things like your date of birth, place of birth, and we'll look at exactly what those identity attributes are in a second. Now, the second chain is an entity chain. Once we have individuals identified and have their identity verified on the identity chain, we have to look at social scenarios in the world and say, well, these individuals may want to identify as a group. Could be a book club or a corporation or anything in between. But the entity chain serves to identify and to record relationships between individuals. Now we have a third chain.
Not quite.
You want to qualify that, Mark?
Sorry, but yes, please.
Sure, go ahead.
The entity chain's job, the entire Kevlar space is about identifying humans.
Right.
And the identity chain identifies individual humans. The entity chain identifies groups of humans. And those groups could be ad hoc clubs or actual corporations and legal entities. If you look up the definitions of corporations and limited liability corporations and partnerships, they are all legal structures that are designed to allow a collective of members to act as if they were a single person.
Right.
That's not the same thing as an individual. So we needed a separate chain to handle just those.
Right. Thank you. So now when we look at our third chain, thank you for that, Mark, we can see that the relationship chain essentially records relationships between identities and entities. And these are similarly globally unique records that link members of these 2 other chains. And the types of relationships we can see are nearly infinite. We can have basic fundamental social relationships all the way to legal and regulatory relationships with regulatory bodies and entities. So I want to show you guys an example of the types of records that we might see on each of these chains. And then we're going to look at some examples of the different types of relationships that we might see in the Kevlar environment. So
are you watching the chat?
Thank you for the reminder.
Because one just went by that I thought was great.
Polygamy and cheaters, yes.
Unfortunately, that will be kind of impossible now, because if you go to register yourself as having a marriage relationship with somebody and then go to register yourself as having a marriage relationship with somebody else, the relationship database will now show you as having 2 marriage relationships, which it will be okay with. But it might throw a red flag given your local jurisdiction, which may or may not allow that.
Or your wife's.
Sure.
Yeah. Or the 2 people you're married to might notice that there's somebody else you're married to too. Yes.
Yes. So that's a good example. Tiger King did 3. Nice. So when we look at an identity chain record, we remember that this is storing just only enough birth information to create a globally unique identity for us. And these records actually only ever receive 2 transactions. They get written when you're born or when you register for the system, and then they get updated when you die. And that's the only time that that records on the identity chain are edited. So let's just run through these core components of a record. We obviously have an identity address. That's what we use to identify and locate ourselves in the Kevlar platform. Registration date, the date that we recorded or registered identity on the identity chain. And we have a self-relationship key, which we're going to use to identify all of the relationships that we have. And I'll explain that self-relationship key once we get to relationships. So for now, let's just skip that one. And obviously we have our basic vital statistics at birth, where we were born, when we were born, what was our name at birth. And of course, when we die, we're going to record that too. And this is the basic fundamental information that we can use to create a unique identity for ourselves. We may change our name, but we'll look at how that's managed in different chains in the network. We may move. That's going to be a different piece of information that we store elsewhere in the system. This identity record is just the core information that says who we are, and it doesn't get updated or changed, is also important. So now let's look at the next type. This is our record on the entity chain. Again, we have our address, locates us and identifies us in the system. We have the entity's name, could be the company's name, at registration, and the type of entity at the registration. And again, we are signifying this as at registration because these things can change. I may register my company as an LLC, become a corporation later on as I go, but that's going to be updated using a relationship with whatever legal body helped me process that change to my entity. We'll look at that later on too. I have my jurisdiction.
You might want to note that on the personal identity record, we didn't put down gender.
That's true.
It's malleable now, so why bother?
Right. And we have our other basic information here. We have the date that the entity was registered. And this is when our company was incorporated or when our book club was formed. And then we have the record registration. This is when we created a record on the entity chain. I'm sorry. We have our self-relationship key for an entity. Again, I'll explain what that means in a second. And then we have a dissolution date, which is the entity's version of date of death. When is the company going to dissolve, or when is the group going to dissolve? And this is the basic information that we need to see in order to create a globally unique identity for an entity. So now to the fun stuff. The relationship chain is really where all of the fun stuff happens in Kevlar. The identity and entity chains, as we've just seen, are basically just present to store immutable records that tell the network who you are. So when we look at a relationship key, we can see that there are some different types of information that we need to look at here. Again, we have our so this time we actually don't have an address. We're not allowing anyone to locate a relationship on the relationship chain. This time, we actually have a relationship key. And the relationship key is an alphanumeric code that is going to be provided to the parties within the relationship. That's basically a password or a key to access this relationship record. We'll have a type of relationship. Again, this could be social, corporate, educational, regulatory, fill in the blank. We obviously have a creation date for our relationship record. And some types of records may have different types of expiry dates. And then the most important thing about our relationship records is we have the scope of the relationship. And the relationship scope is where we actually talk about the unique information that we are disclosing or sharing with the other person that we have entered into a relationship with. So let's look at an example of that.
Why don't we go through the questions first?
And yeah, Nate.
Oh, we have questions. I'm sorry. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah. So, would Kevlar substitute all other IDs? I mean, would it make other IDs such as passport invalid? That's a great question, Kevin. And the short answer that I'll tell you now is that Kevlar will initially be designed to work with and accommodate existing forms of identification. However, and we're going to look at this later on in the presentation, as Kevlar becomes more widely used, it's our goal to ultimately integrate directly with government agencies that are responsible for both issuing and regulating these passports, driver's licenses, integrating directly with them and actually digitizing those forms of identity. So initially, we'll be working with documentary ID as it exists today. We'll be working with verification providers to verify those things, but we can see that an evolution of that that initial process will be getting rid of the document verification providers and going direct to the source of the people issuing those documents. Okay.
But the idea that an identity is different than confirming citizenship, right?
An identity is different from confirming citizenship. So your citizenship is an attribute of your identity. And let me walk through this, Karen, and tell me if this doesn't answer that question for you. I think that's all the questions for now. So when I first join Kevlar, I'm going to download an app. And let's say, or I'm going to download an app. And the first thing that I'm going to need to do is prove or verify that basic information that I'm going to have recorded on my identity record. And like I just mentioned to you, Kevin, that's initially we're going to accomplish that with our verification providers. That's the participant that said, I can prove it, remember? So as an end user, I'm going to go through an onboarding process on my Kevlar app, and I'm going to provide the documentary evidence of my age and of my identity. The verification provider is going to review that evidence, and they're going to record a blockchain record if it gets approved. You can ignore this drinking age. This is left over from another example. So let's look at what that relationship record would look like. Here I am. I'm an individual. And I'm entering into this relationship with this third-party verification provider. Could be Onfido, any of the common providers out there that we'll look at using. We have an origin date. And I'm going to come back to this expiry date for a second, but let's look at our relationship scope. So the first thing that I did was I disclosed all of the information that would be found on my passport. And this is going to be accomplished likely as from the user experiences perspective. I'm just going to take a picture of it. But as far as the record's going to concerned, it's actually going to pull the raw data, obviously. So I'm going to provide this basic identity information to the verification provider. And the verification provider is only going to enter into this relationship with me if they approve this information using their existing processes. Remember, this is what these companies do. They provide verifications of documentary evidence and government issued IDs. So I'm going to disclose this information to the verification provider. They're going to verify it. And if it's approved, they're going to enter into this relationship with me. So what are they disclosing to me? The first thing that they're doing is they're disclosing their entity record. So whenever I want, I can go and use my relationship key to check on what's the company that completed my verification, the basic information that'll be stored in that company's entity record. And then that party is also disclosing a rating. And that rating is basically just a metric that allows a user to see how trustworthy is that verification provider within the system. And we'll look at an example of how the rating works in a second. Now, a couple more pieces to this relationship record. This is a little bit of a complex one, is we have a last verification date. So this last verification date is essentially going to be a record of the last time that the verification provider checked on my document. We'll have a deletion date and a deletion party. But the last thing I want to point out here is that if we look at the expiry date of this relationship record, that's actually the same as the expiry date of my passport. So what this relationship record is telling us is that once my passport expires, this record of this verification provider's approval of this information is going to expire. So let's assume for this example that this verification provider has approved me. We're looking at our relationship record between the two of us. So what can I do with this information now? What if I want to go access a web platform? So in a Kevlar scenario, a web platform, upon my registration, is going to request a new relationship where I disclose the information that this dating app requires to admit me to the platform. I'm going to most likely accept that relationship and provide those proof of information records. So let's look at what that type of record would look like. Here we are. We have our two parties, me and Dating Plus, my imaginary dating app. And let's look at what I've disclosed to the dating app. Only two things. All the dating app needed to know is that, am I 18 or older? Yes. And it's going to check my birth name to see if I'm on any watch lists. So this is kind of a special relationship integration that this dating app would have. And it would tell the Kevlar system, this is the only information we need. And the way you're going to check this is by comparing the date of birth, obviously. And I'm just going to check the birth name to see if it matches any lists. And so the dating app can actually permit access to the user, to me, without seeing any of my personal identity information that I'm storing on my identity record or within any of my relationships. Remember, this verification is stored in a relationship, not directly in my identity record. So I didn't share that with any of that with the dating app. I've just provided these records that rely on those blockchain records to tell the dating app that I'm okay to enter. Now, the other benefit to this is not only is the dating app not seeing this information, they don't have to store it. So Kevlar serves as a massive benefit and cost savings to companies like dating apps and really any company or web platform that has to store sensitive information, because they can rely on Kevlar as a trustworthy source of identity information, and they don't have to store any of it themselves. So we eliminate our risks of centralization and centralized database hacks. We eliminate risks of accidental bad actors within a company. there's all this added security that companies get to benefit from just by using Kevlar. Check on our questions here.
There he is.
Fate, you can't see the chat.
Oh, because that goes back to my earlier question, though, was, does this make people more or less subject to fraud and identity theft?
Identity theft is nearly impossible in this world, in the world of Kevlar, once it's reached reasonably mass adoption, because it's very hard to be able to steal someone's identity when they're the one holding the private key, unless of course you put a gun to their head.
But you can keep asking questions until you get.
What questions are you asking?
Yeah,
right? You're right, Karen. So let me give you an example of that. If you're a stranger trying to ask me questions about my identity, I'm going to have records of everything I've disclosed to you. And I'm going to get warned that, hey, you've shared your name and your age with this stranger. You might want to stop doing that. They don't have a very good rating within the Kevlar system.
And if they're not on the system, then they can't read the data anyway.
Right. Does that answer your question, Karen?
It's actually, the question you're asking, Karen, leads down a rabbit hole of implications of verifiable proof of identity that have significant general social impacts that we try not to discuss, generally speaking, because some people will find it terrifying.
Because, and then the opposite of that, my second question was, so many businesses are in business because of the data that they're collecting on people.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
If they don't collect that, then they don't have it. So the Amazons and the banks go bust.
Well, no.
Yeah. Well,
no, they don't go bust. Amazon, unfortunately, will have to rejig how it processes its data. What they won't have is the ability to cross-match that data that they're holding with other entities. So they won't be able to go to, Amazon won't be able to buy some data from Facebook so they can find out more about their customers. Or, from Google or any other, sort of social network platform, because every every relationship you have is uniquely identified and not the same identity key on that platform, because it's a relationship key, not your identity. Therefore, there's no way to cross-match your activity on Google with your activity on Facebook with your activity on Amazon. Even though you're still accountable for all of it, but you're accountable for the actions, and you don't have to worry that somebody's going to be able to take your data and cross-match, because there's no way to do it.
Okay.
And I would add to that, data, companies having control and ownership and freedom to use, analyze, sell customer data, I think most people would agree is an early implementation of data and how businesses are using it. But ethically, individuals should have a right to both control permission of use and to benefit from the use of their data. So while you're right, Karen, the Amazons of the world are kind of currently in the data Wild West, where there are no checks and balances on how they use things. Kevlar is one of the things that we hope will start to shift the status quo in the other direction, where we're giving individuals back control of their data.
Yeah.
Privacy is a two-way street.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is where you started.
And there we go.
There's a key add-on to the dating app relationship as well. And that is that while you've only disclosed are you old enough to use this, and are you not on a watch list? In this case, with a dating app, it would be, are you a criminal or not, or have you been a criminal or not?
Right.
In which case they may block you from joining. But the keys that are exchanged, so party one and party two addresses, Those are part of the record, but not disclosed to either owner of the record. So party one doesn't know what party two's address is, and party two does not know what party one's address is. So they can't go look them up directly.
Right.
They
or in
only
this
get
case,
access.
age. The dating app doesn't know how old I am.
Yeah, they can't. No, they can't look up your age. They can only look up that. But there is a secondary capability set that will be built into Kevlar, and that is that when a justice component of a government registers, they will get an automatic relationship with everybody who is under their jurisdiction.
Right.
At which point, there will be a legal system built into Kevlar that will allow, under court order from that jurisdiction, Kevlar will find the owner, find it if the court decides that that relationship record did something bad. In the dating world, there was an assault, right? And the dating app knows who assaulted who because they've got a police report to say so, and they go to the court and say the person who has this relationship key with us assaulted somebody through a connection on our platform. The court looks at the evidence and says, yes, we want to charge that person. The system will, with a, by the way, recorded on-chain, publicly disclosed court order, give that agency within the government the relationship key that they have with the same individual.
Right.
And that relationship key discloses everything: your address, your name, your phone number, your social insurance number, whatever other normal legal data you must provide to your government in order to be considered a legal citizen. So it protects the users of the dating app in that respect.
Yeah. Does anyone else have questions?
And I'm going to give another example of that regulatory role in here. So maybe we'll drum up some more questions in a bit. But overall, I think this is a good first explanation of a relationship. And I actually have one or two more to show you guys. So let's look at this example. We can also have relationships with devices. Let's say that alcohol vending machines exist, which they could do when Kevlar is built. As an individual, I can share my proof of age record with the vending machine, probably via a near-field communication. And that vending machine can verify my age, no more risk of fake IDs, no more necessity to store this information. And I can get my alcohol. Yay.
Let's be careful here. That's not a relationship with the device. That's a relationship with the company that owns the device.
Yes, thank you. Vodka vendors, here we are. So in this record, we can see that there's very basic information disclosed. All I've done is proven that I'm age 21 or older. And this relationship is all that's needed to allow me to use vodka vendors' devices.
That and money.
Of course. So there's a second example, and I have one more for you. Look at a college admissions scenario. I may need to prove that I'm of some special nationality, but I'm not. I'm just from the U.S. So I may need to prove that I'm a United States born national to a college admissions staff. And I'm not sure how it is in Canada, but in the United States, college admissions, college systems are extremely popular targets of hacking and hackers. I actually had my personal information stolen twice while I was an undergraduate. So this is a real issue. With Kevlar, though, I can share a proof of birth record with the admissions staff, and they can verify my nationality without storing that sensitive data. This is a big security bonus and cost savings for college admission staffs. And what would that record look like? Maybe I was applying to George Brown. Here's my party too. And all I'm disclosing is my place of birth. It's another basic disclosure relationship example. Check on our questions here. Does anyone have any questions about these different types of relationships and records that I've shown so far?
Right.
Fate says
your disclosure here on this one, just to finalize that, your disclosure would be, are you a U.S. citizen? Yes. Or a U.S. resident? Yes. There'd be no requirement for you to disclose United States per se. It's implied, but it wouldn't necessarily need to be on the record. Does that make sense?
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about it from the actual student like experience scenario where I would need to define the country, but from a privacy standpoint, you're right. Fate says face app detection was given to the police system unofficially. I think this has to be released that way too.
Face app detection is actually a new relationship that we're looking forward to adding to the panoply of relationships that will be possible as a verification of identity as well, where your images that have been verified as being you, passport picture, things like that, which are stored securely and encrypted off-chain with pointers on-chain to those documentary evidence pieces. We would run that software on your face and record in the relationship between you and the face verification system your actual digital version of your face map. And then anywhere else you go in the world, you could literally put your face in front of a camera. It would face map you, reduce that to its basically the geometric parameters of your face, right, which is a lot smaller than the image of your face in terms of data size, and compare that geometric analysis with the one that's on chain. If it matches, you're you. If it doesn't match, you're not you. But it's a relationship because people get their noses broken. People get in car accidents. People grow beards, right? And so you would need to be able to constantly, at your leisure, and obviously when it's working for you or not working for you, update your face map.
Right.
Cool. New world.
Yes, the future is now, Kevin. Okay, so we've looked at those records. We've looked at some examples of different types of relationships. And there's kind of one more element to the blockchain architecture of Kevlar that I want to point out. And that is the scalability. So we've talked about several examples of public global blockchain solutions being challenging to execute because of bandwidth limitations. Supply chain solutions is one we looked at. So how can then Kevlar scale globally? If we look, our identity chain and our entity chain are designed to have very infrequent transactions. Remember, we only have 2 transactions per record, birth and death, or registration and death. Relationship chains, though, we have frequent updates to transactions, or updates to records, I'm sorry. So how do we solve this transaction load problem in our relationship chains? Well, early on, this won't be an issue, of course, but as we begin to scale, the solution for that is group specific relationship chains. So instead of forcing all relationship records to be recorded on a single blockchain, sophisticated groups who will have to have a strong rating on the Kevlar platform will enable these groups to set up their own relationship chains. Now, there's nothing special about Airbnb's relationship chain or Amazon's relationship chain. All these separate chains serve to do is A, to solve the scalability issue of a single relationship chain for global use. But B, they also allow the Amazons and the Airbnbs of the world to be involved in the customization of the types of relationships that they want to store. Amazon, for example, Amazon may want to store certain aspects of their transactions on their relationship chains. So setting up their own chain would enable them to do that. But the core reason that we have this architecture is our scalability issue, and this is how we solve that at a 1,000-mile view. Mark, did you want to add to that? No.
I think the chicken said it all.
You were muted. We didn't get to hear the chicken this time. So the next thing that I want to talk about is, and it's kind of alludes to your question, Karen, which is that how do we know that Amazon is who they say they are? How do we know that the verification provider who checked on my driver's license is to be trusted? And there's a very simple solution for this. It's a derivative of what we see in web platforms today, which is ratings. So how do we know which verification providers to trust? Each time an identity or an entity creates a relationship with a verification provider, say it's on Fido, they're going to give that verification provider a rating based on the scope of the request. Was it out of the ordinary for what I was trying to accomplish? Was there anything inappropriate about the experience? Did they cancel my relationship before they should have? So this is just a basic metric to say which verification providers are the good actors in the system. It's similar to when we look at staking in a proof of stake network, we have validators. There are different metrics that we will rate the performance and the trustworthiness of those validators in the network. The same thing applies to platforms. Imagine there's a new Amazon, call them Amazon 2, and I need to access, in order to access Amazon 2, I need to use Kevlar. But before I enter into a relationship with Amazon 2, I need to know that they're a trustworthy organization that I would be safe to disclose this information with and to enter into a relationship with. So the same rating system applies to platforms, where each entity, each entity in the Kevlar network will have this similar privacy rating. So this is kind of how we achieve trust at kind of a fundamental level between different verification providers and entities on the platform. Now, verification providers, like we pointed out, they're not perfect. And it's actually a pretty loose set of businesses because we have this fragmentation of verification services kind of vertically integrated within industries, as opposed to a holistic and a universal solution for verifying universal identity.
Do you see Fate's question about who the validators are?
So that's a good question, Fate. In Kevlar, every participant in the system will be operating as a node, which means that every participant in the system will be able to participate in the on-chain governance. Now, the validators in this case, there will be a voting system to determine or to onboard nodes to become validators. So you could be a validator in the Kevlar network if you choose to, and if you are capable of running the software and following the rules. So that's how validators will be approached in Kevlar. The point that I want to make with this verification providers aren't perfect either slide is that this is just the design of Kevlar in utilizing verification providers is just meant to improve and to solve the inefficiencies of today's identity industry. Our vision for identity in the future does not include verification providers. it's entirely feasible to go directly to the source, to the government agencies, and to digitize these driver's licenses and passport documents. So ultimately integrating with these agencies and use identity documents, and digitizing identity documents is ultimately where we want to get to with verified identity within Kevlar. So let's look at an example of how a government agency or a regulatory agency might participate as an entity within Kevlar. Here's an example of how fragmented the identity landscape is. It's a lot of companies. So let's look at this example. The DMV of California, Department of Motor Vehicles, has issued me a digital driver's license. I'm going to be able to have that driver's license immediately and irrefutably verified within Kevlar. And I now have a digital representation of my driver's license. And I can go ahead and prove that I'm legally allowed to drive using Kevlar. So I'm not only verifying the information on my driver's license, I'm also verifying my driver's license as a proof of right to drive. So let's say I get pulled over. An example of this regulatory entity, a police agency in a region where the Department of Motor Vehicles or the driver's license agency is integrated with Kevlar. Inherently in that region, the police group, whatever police force is in charge of governing that region, would have a relationship with the DMV. And that regulatory relationship would give the police force the permission to access drivers' personal information without following the relationship process that we've just followed. Now, as a driver, I'm still getting notified that the patrol officer has access to this information. And as Mark pointed out, that's actually a new relationship that gets created between me and the patrol officer. It's just not one that I get to approve or deny. Mark, do you want to add anything to that real world example? I know it differed a little bit from the case that you gave.
It's slightly different. When the officer is checking your identity and when you or get pulled over,
mm-hmm.
They are checking your driver's license information, which you present to them via your Kevlar app, basically a tap of some kind, or and an exchange where you say, yes, I'm good to disclose my driver's license information. But he's not acting as a police officer individual here. He's acting as a member of the entity that is I guess the California Highway Patrol, for example.
Right.
Who has rights to access, who, by the way, you already have a relationship with, because the minute the Highway Patrol went online on the Kevlar system, mm-hmm. They got access to everybody who is basically everybody who lives or is in California at the time when they're pulled over. Right. And what happens is that your Kevlar ID relationship with that government is now passed to the police officer, not just showing whether or not you're legal to drive, although it'll do that for sure, mm-hmm. But it will also show whether or not you are currently wanted by the police or the courts.
Right. Cool.
And they can get all that information in literally a matter of a second or two, rather than having to go back to their car and type your name in to look up if there's any warrants on you and then all that fun stuff.
Right.
That just happens automatically. But it's all based on the idea that the government has a system connected to Kevlar.
Right.
And that's, by the way, where the validators all come from, right? every entity that sets up a relationship chain, California would have its own, right? Possibly several, but depending on the branches of government that would get involved, must be running not only the validators for their relationship chain, but also an entity and an identity chain as well. So we don't have to incentivize. The chicken apparently doesn't like that idea. But anyway, we don't have to incentivize the validators with cash. The validators are incentivized because in order to participate in the ecosystem of identity, right, they have to maintain one validator, which relative expenses factored is much cheaper than what they're currently paying to maintain their existing infrastructures.
Right. Thanks for explaining that. I didn't have that in my slides. So cool. That's, I think, a good summary of regulatory officers and agencies' roles in the system. So the last concept I wanted to cover, and then we can open up the floor to questions and discussion, is the economics and the kind of the operating structure of how Kevlar will exist. We already talked a little bit about on-chain governance, and I want to show you this graphic and walk through it. So Kevlar, we can see on our right, is a decentralized platform. Each participant is operating as a node, and like Mark just pointed out, entities and other types of participants will operate as validators. Now, a nonprofit foundation will be governed by Kevlar's on-chain governance or decentralized organization. So this nonprofit foundation is essentially a group of people who are basically operators and managers responsible for dispersing funds, executing processes according to the results of votes and proposals that come through Kevlar's on-chain governance. Now, the third piece of this is we have external entities who will integrate with Kevlar. The use cases for Kevlar are pretty infinite. I'll just ramble off a few. Border control, retail loyalty, flight miles, peer-to-peer commerce apps, insurance, abuse prevention for free trials, digital rights management. Pretty much all matchmaking apps that you can think of, whether it's TaskRabbit, dating, jobs, professional networks, charitable giving. I could go on. But the point here is that there will be lots of external entities who will be benefiting from Kevlar's identity solution. And they'll get to do that largely at cost. And in exchange for that, these external entities will commit a portion of their revenues to the foundation, knowing that those revenues will only be allocated according to Kevlar's on-chain and decentralized governance. So while there's no economic incentive or return on investment incentive for Kevlar, there still is a healthy economic model that basically will provide a consistent flow of funds to support Kevlar's evolution and adaptation as it grows. So this is a pretty novel concept for a business structure. It's one that's only been conceptualized since blockchain came around. But Kevlar provides a really good opportunity for this type of business structure to happen, and that's the structure that Kevlar is going to follow. So that finishes up my concepts. I do want to talk about ongoing participation in Kevlar, but before we do that, have any other questions come up or come in for that matter?
I've got one.
Sure.
Can anyone think of a scenario in modern life where Kevlar wouldn't improve things?
Shrey, we'll do your question next.
because Nathaniel's list of use case possibilities for Kevlar is indicative. I challenge anyone to come up with any interaction that you have in your life from birth to death that doesn't at some level or another require either faith, which is risky, or proof of identity and accountability, which is what Kevlar brings.
It's just that the people who won't benefit are the ones that are currently making money from that process.
Yes.
True, but it's I mean, there's always change in the in the world.
Sure.
I mean, the KYC AML industry has only been around for about 10 years. And in fact, KYC, I would say, is probably less than that, maybe 7. That it's actually been around as an industry. And if it goes away next year or 5 years from now, it's not because the world economy is going to crumble because of it.
Those people will not benefit. But as
with any innovation,
all the time, yeah.
Any innovation is going to piss some powerful people off, or else it's not that innovative. Benny, if you're saying illicit activity is one thing that Kevlar wouldn't improve, you're exactly right. But
yes.
it would improve
crime. It'll make crime more
investigation.
difficult. Damn. The part of the. Sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I was just looking at Shrey's comment.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's the accountability side of this whole thing that is unheard of in society, unless you've ever lived in a small town. Right. It basically turns the entire planet into a small town. You can't get away with anything once Kevlar's fully onboarded, because everything you do in terms of interactions where you have committed to do something and then don't, in other words, you are to a greater or lesser degree a bad actor, follows you around for the rest of your life.
And then as Shrey's comment before that, but it can be corrected as well, right?
So Shrey says, what if a person has been falsely accused, gets verified by validators, and later found to be innocent? Can we make changes?
Yes. That's your relationship with the courts in whatever jurisdiction you were charged and convicted in. And you can go into that relationship and say reversed.
Well, the judge can, not you.
Well, yeah, not you yourself. No, obviously. One of the things that we haven't really discussed in detail about the relationship chain concept is that relationships, there's 2 types of relationships. There's static and dynamic. Static relationships are, I was born, right? And there's a hospital record that says I was born. That's never going to change, right? It gets created once. I get a relationship with the hospital, and the hospital discloses my birth record to the system, and then it's done. They can't undo it, because that would mean that I wasn't born at that hospital. But by the same token, there are also dynamic relationships. And in this case, the relationship record is constantly being updated. So your relationship with, for example, with the revenue division of your government would have every tax return you've ever filed attached to it. And every year when you file a new one, they would add a new record, a new addition to your relationship record with them. So it becomes a little sort of private database between you and the government that says that the government acknowledges, and you obviously agree, that you paid your taxes. And it shows every year that you paid your taxes. And they can't go back and undo it because they signed off on it. You did. You can't delete it because, well, for starters, why would you? But by the same token, you also get to say that if they come back and reassess you, that's another record. And then if you have to pay off a larger tax bill, When you pay it, that's another record. So that's a dynamic relationship where the initial setup is pretty simple. It's the usual party one, party two, and and the scope of disclosures. But then after that happens, then every time something new happens that is relevant and should be, immutably stored, it gets added to the bottom of that record.
Right. A good example of that is rent payments. If you've ever applied to rent an apartment or a house, the number one thing the landlord is going to look for is, have you been on time with your payments to previous as a previous tenant? That's a perfect example of a dynamic relationship.
Right. And the other thing to be aware of is that in your disclosures, when you're setting up a relationship, you aren't just necessarily disclosing, your vital statistics. You may also be asked to disclose whether you have a relationship with a validator and what is the rating of that validator. You may be asked to disclose, do you have a relationship with your government or not? You may be asked to disclose, do you have a criminal record? All right. Again, these would all be necessarily binary answers, yes, no, but they're actually the information that is used to answer those questions is information that is in your relationships, not in your identity.
Right.
So the more relationships you have, the richer your identity becomes.
Right. Mark, how long have we been working on Kevlar? It's all a blur.
What was that? We started it probably
2018?
late 2018. Yeah. We started digging into the architecture of it early last year.
Right. So it's been a concept that we've been designing and learning from each of our clients how to tweak it and make it better.
And experts in the industry and the other projects that are currently ongoing in the industry. There's a lot of theoretical work going on right now all across the world on ways to accomplish digital identities. Kevlar, so far, the model we've built is unique, but who knows? It can't be for long. Sooner or later, someone else is going to come up with the same idea.
Right. Cool. Any more questions that anyone has? And I also want to finish by getting an idea from the people here who would be interested in continuing to participate in this project with us. Now, let me tell you what that means. So we've been talking with Karen and some of the other professors about work integrated learning experiences and co-op experiences, but unfortunately, that's not going to start until, I believe, the semester that starts in September. So what we're going to do in the meantime is identify who is interested in working with us in a product design capacity. We're going to take the architecture, help you understand the core components, and then work to design product documentation that will help students, when we get to September, get started more quickly. That will be defining the actual product of Kevlar itself, but it'll also be doing things like analyzing the most opportunistic use cases and researching verification providers. So there's a lot of research and product design that's going to be really exciting to accomplish over the next 3 months. And one piece that I'll add to that is that a particular timely use case of Kevlar is contact tracing, as we talked about with you, Fete, yesterday. So definitely a particular area of this next couple month focus with the students that do participate with us is going to be designing that contact tracing solution and even designing it for release and launch within George Brown's campus community. So this could be a really exciting use case that George Brown could take and not only release within their community to test, but also be responsible for when it gets released and used by the greater world. So there's a lot of cool stuff that's going on over the next couple months. I'll answer that question in a second, Kevin. So what I wanted to ask you guys was, if you're interested in participating with us, just pop your email address in the chat here, and I'll make a note of it. And we'll follow up with everyone that has expressed interest today. It's probably going to be Monday of next week, because I want to get an idea of who's interested and plan accordingly. So if you guys express interest today, we can follow up with you Monday and introduce the immediate project. I'm sorry. And Kevin, to answer your question, so at BlockBlocks, we do a mixture of client solutions and research. So this would be an example of a research project. So it's part of the work we do, but we also solve direct business problems as well. See some emails coming in here. Awesome.
Thanks, Nate.
Of course.
As we've demonstrated through the use cases we're talking about in here, for example, the COVID or more generally pandemic contact tracing application, which would be sort of a decentralized version of what's going on in the UK and Europe right now, and the US, where they're, Apple, Google, that's centralized. The UK solution is also centralized. The difference is the UK solution is centralized on government servers versus Apple and Google obviously centralized on their own servers. The Kevlar solution would be decentralized, and the data would actually be sitting on everyone's devices, and then selectively disclosed anonymously to governments who decide that they want to get involved in using the tool, and potentially even to a large degree mandating the use of the tool to their populations in order to manage and control contact for viruses. That would be a paying gig. The minute we've got a customer, everyone's getting paid.
Right.
So anyone else? Ankit, what about you? Does this sound like something that you'd be interested in continuing the discussions on?
And if product design sounded daunting to anyone, essentially what we're doing is just taking everything that we've discussed now and talking about how best to engage you students to accomplish it. So don't be scared by the product design, because a lot of this participation in the immediate future is going to be you sharing with us what you think would work with students on your end. So there's definitely knowledge and insight to be shared on both sides. So don't be scared of the product design.
At all levels, right? Because a lot of the students here are postgrads, and Shrey
Right.
is not. So at all levels. So Shrey, would you
Right.
be interested? Oh, so Shrey, should we put you on? Yes, he would. So provide your email, okay, Shrey?
And I will go ahead and share my email if anyone is on the fence and you want to think about it. Just you can jot my email down and shoot me an email if you decide you want to participate. So Shrey, I've got yours.
And it's possible that some of the other people who weren't on the call today, when we post the recordings, might also want to follow up on that as well.
Of course. Good idea. And if you all have any friends or students that couldn't make it, excuse me, need some water. Feel free to share this with them too. Joining today was not a requisite of participation.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot, Nate. That was the whole series was really, really interesting.
course.
And
Thanks for having me, Karen. This was fun.
yeah, and I think the opportunity to continue the discussion is going to be amazing, and we'll keep the students updated through on these discussions for what we might do in the fall as well as the spring through the LinkedIn group. And I'll post the recordings of today's session, and all of the other sessions have been posted. I just created a YouTube channel for the club, so you'll have all of the videos organized together for easier viewing. And thanks a lot. I think we finished the series off with this session today. Really appreciate it, Nate. And then everyone else there's one last session about the job hunt for new Canadians from the experience of a fellow international student who's now at Microsoft, and she'll share her journey and suggestions. I think that's it. Any last questions for Nate? But you have his email for sure. Learned a lot, definitely.
Thank you, Karen, for organizing this and coordinating all the recordings. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hey, before we run away, just to make sure everyone understands, this is not just a software build project.
I was going to leave with some inspiration too, but you go for it, Mark.
Yeah, it's a software build. Yes, there's going to be a software build, and you will not be alone. You will have other software developers, professional software developers, who will be working with you to execute this project. But there's also an entire component of this. For each use case, there will be analytics requirements to come up with dashboards, for example, for the contact tracing that can be used by governments or medical institutions in order to help figure out where things are going and that kind of stuff. All those analytics solutions are going to need to get built as well. And that's not so much a software project as it is I understand how to do data analysis within a particular domain. That too is going to need to be built. And that goes for almost any type of relationship.
Yeah. And I think that this is also, it's about new business models, new processes, new ethical considerations. So it's not just about technology, it's all of the business around it, which is very interesting.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Awesome.
We're calling it.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks again, Karen.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everyone.